Let's go in depth tonight on something many of you are coming across in our mountains over the last few weeks. Have you heard of this before?
I have.
Okay, so this is not new. I want everyone to know out there it's not new, but maybe a little bit more prevalent. It's red or pink snow. The nickname is watermelon snow. There is a scientific name. You're much better than that than I am, especially in your meteorological realm. See, I couldn't even say your profession. So what is watermelon snow? Is it safe to touch? Where does it come from? I spoke with the Utah State University Watershed Sciences professor who's been studying watermelon snow for years.
Interesting stuff. It's very interesting.
Even though it's red, and what people commonly see is red, and what people call it watermelon because it's red, it's actually a green algal bloom. So it's a green algae that lays dormant in the snowpack or in the soil during the summer and winter. And then in the spring, when there's enough moisture in the snowpack and there's the right nutrient combination and temperature, that dormant cyst is triggered to actually move into its more reproductive life stage, and it swims its way to the surface of the snowpack with this little piece called a flagella, and then it blooms. And the bloom is what people actually see. So that red pigmentation is part of the blooming reproductive process for the algae's life cycle. And that red coloration is actually a red pigment that the algae produce because they're in a really high UV environment that also is essentially kind of like a desert, more of a snow desert, because while if you're on a snowfield, you're out skiing, you're surrounded by tons of water, but that water is not very accessible. And so you can't just reach down with a cup and drink from, the snowpack. And so they produce this pigment that allows them to absorb solar radiation, which warms up their individual cells, melts the water around them so they have something to use, but it has the secondary effect of protecting them from UV. So I'm very light-skinned, so I obviously have a hard time in high UV environments. It's the same thing with humans. People that have more pigmentation in their skin can do better in higher UV areas without sunscreen and other stuff. So algae are the same idea.
Are these also harmful to people?
So that's a great question, and one that I'm glad you brought up. So there's no human health impact of snow algae directly. They do not harm you if you eat snow algae or drink water that was melted from it. They don't harm you if you come into contact with them. They're totally harmless to humans directly. Their challenge for us and the way they impact human health is more secondarily, and that's because by producing this pigment and absorbing light, they actually melt snowpack. And so they can accelerate the melt of Utah's snowpack just by their presence and their blooming. The same way people talk a lot about dust on snow and how dust from the Great Salt Lake can get onto our snowpack, absorb more solar radiation and melt. Having any kind of imperfection like that in the snowpack drives melting. And so snow algae is the same idea. And so it's more a water resource and water availability timing question than anything related to human health. I mean, I think the main takeaway for me is I'm excited people are noticing it and talking about it. And it's fun for me as someone who studies high mountain systems. And it also shows that, while people think of these high mountain areas with snow and ice as being pretty much biologically dead zones, there's not much there. I think it's the same way as how people have long viewed the deep sea. And now we're learning that actually there's a lot more biologically happening in high mountains. There are organisms, like snow algae. There are these really fascinating things called ice worms, which don't actually live in Utah, but eat snow algae. There's just all this stuff going on in these high mountain landscapes that are, really important, but that we don't spend a ton of time in.
So I really enjoyed that conversation with Scott today because he lays it out pretty simple, which is for me always difficult. The complexities of some of the professors when they break things down for you, he brought it down to the level I needed to really understand that. And I hope it resonated to all of you that watched the same thing. What was your takeaway from that?
I thought it was fascinating, and it also tells you that there's still a food chain, even at that level of life. You've got this little algae and there's a worm coming after it.
So we didn't show his hand movement there of what he did when it was swimming, but he literally went whoop to the top. So it was pretty fascinating, but it's more common this year. He mentioned because of the snowpack, obviously the record winter. Right. That was a portion that we did not include in there, but it was an obvious portion of why we're seeing more of it It's just a result of what we've had.
And all of that stuff that is growing in the snow that makes it white, it's going to actually fertilize the vegetation too when it dies and melts, or melts and dies. So
Funny how
there you go.
they all play it.
Everything plays together. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating.
Well, thanks for watching 2 News Live. Thanks for joining us for some unique, in-depth perspectives tonight. Thanks to Sterling for being here as well.
Great to be with you, Brian.
Well, you know, it's not so bad.
No,
it
it's
could be
not.
worse.